Are you struggling with the TOEFL listening section? Let's practice together. Today we'll go through 2 full lectures on the topic of agriculture. Not only will this be great listening practice, but it's also a chance to refresh your agriculture-related vocabulary. This topic comes up a lot on the TOEFL, whether it's in listening, reading, writing, or speaking. So be sure to write down any new words you encounter. By the way, I have a separate video on agriculture vocabulary for TOEFL, so be sure to check that out if you haven't already. I'm also planning to upload more videos with useful vocabulary, so don't forget to subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon to get notified when the next video comes out. Let's get started. Lecture 1.
Listen to part of a university lecture on agriculture. Good afternoon, class. We've been looking at various scenarios of the world's population problems and their possible solutions over our last few classes. And today I'd like us to take a quick look at one of the solutions to the growing problem of supplying enough food for us all. It's called dry land farming. Dry land farming is a set of agricultural practices, agricultural techniques that should be, or need to be, used to produce profitable crops in areas where the rainfall or the snowfall is slight, is erratic, or is very seasonal, and is generally less than about 50 centimeters a year. All over the world, there are countries that must use these less than optimal lands to grow their food. The North American prairies, the South American pampas, the Russian steppes, the Middle East. All of these areas have marginal rainfall precipitation. Almost half of India's arable cultivatable land, 47 out of a total of 108 million hectares, is dry land, as opposed to land fed by adequate rainfall. Originally, these lands were covered with well-adapted grasses, but today, much of the natural cover is gone, and these vast plains are seen as, potentially at least, our global breadbasket. Now, dryland farming is something that must be practiced in places where the land is inherently only barely suited for food production in the first place, and you can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. But there are a number of things you can do that can improve the situation, the conditions for successful farming. Water is of course a key, or the key requirement, and the little participation that does fall must be captured and conserved and used sparingly. Providing windbreaks and providing some light shade and leaving residues from previous crops can often save water, keep it from evaporating so quickly. And weeding can save the water that weeds would otherwise drink up. If the countryside is hilly, terracing can be used, and this goes along with contour plowing to prevent runoff. In some areas, it may even be feasible to build cisterns so that rainwater can be collected and stored. Also, planting the seeds carefully, with consideration, choosing precisely the right time to plant them, choosing the optimum seed depth, and so forth, can help use the available moisture efficiently. Mentioning seeds brings me to the next point: crop choice. Drought-resistant varieties, heat-tolerant varieties, of wheat or corn for instance, must be chosen or developed. Varieties that can stand hot, dry conditions, whose seeds will germinate in such adverse conditions, and which have growth cycles, life cycles, that are fitted to the conditions they must face. With careful attention to these choices and to these practices we're talking about here, even crops like watermelons have been grown successfully in dry lands. So, conserving and carefully distributing what rainfall is available, and choosing crops that can best tolerate dry conditions, are key factors for success. And the soil itself is also a key factor. Dryland soils are, as you might expect, relatively poor in nutrients because dry conditions allow a lot of topsoil to be blown away. So the quality of the thin topsoils must be preserved and maintained as carefully as possible. The most obvious help here is fertilizers, but other techniques like mulching, putting a protective cover over the field like old vegetable matter, plant stalks and leaves for instance, or plastic sheeting, and minimal tillage, minimal plowing help solve this problem of soil deterioration, as well as the other main soil problem, erosion. Erosion can also be fought with windbreaks and strip farming, which is the planting of alternate strips of land each growing season. As I said before, dry lands by their nature are not very good, relatively speaking, for growing our food, and part of that is that they are more susceptible to low crop yields or complete crop failures. This is something that dryland farmers must always keep in mind and must always plan for, be ready to deal with. If the year turns ugly, if it is even drier and colder or hotter than usual, the farmer must be ready and willing to abandon his effort for that year, and in that way to save his fertilizers and his seeds and his energies. On the other hand, in promising years, where the weather is boding fair, the farmer should be quick to take advantage of it by boosting yields with extra or broader plantings, by extending his growing cycle and so on, and of course by working longer and harder at it. With such approaches as these and others we develop, the productivity of such marginal dry lands may be able to help us keep up with our irresistible growing populations. We can at least take hope in the thought that the natives of the arid American Southwest, the Hopi, the Zuni, the Navajo, survived for hundreds of years on dryland farming in an area with rainfall of less than 25 centimeters a year.
Question 1. How has the professor organized his lecture? The correct answer is D, by key elements. At the very beginning of the lecture, the professor says that we're going to talk about one of the solutions to the growing problem of providing enough food for all of us. He says the name of this solution is dry land farming. It's a set of agricultural techniques. It's usually used in places where the land is not suitable for food production. And then the professor starts talking about the key elements of dry land farming, such as water conservation, crop selection, soil quality, and the risks associated with unpredictable weather. That's his way of organizing the lecture. Question 2. The professor mentions watermelons as an example of what? The correct answer is C, an unusual success. When the professor starts talking about choosing crops, he says that the only special kinds of seeds should be chosen. They should be drought-resistant, heat-tolerant, and so on. If you pay attention to the choice of seeds and plan carefully, even crops like watermelons can be successfully grown in dry areas. This tells us that it's not easy to grow watermelons in hot conditions, so it's an unusual success to be able to grow one. 3. According to the lecture, which is not true of dry land agriculture. Answer B is correct. It's practiced in half of Russia's arable lands. In the lecture, the professor mentioned Russia as one of the countries that must use less than optimal lands. But first, he never mentioned whether or not dry land agriculture is already practiced in Russia. And second, he talks about the Russian steppes and never says whether they make up half of Russia's arable lands. As for other statements, they are true. Dry land farming is a collection of methods, requires water, and faces erratic productivity. Question 4. What is one of the main challenges of dry land farming? The soil loses nutrients and is easily eroded. A is the correct answer. The professor explains that dry land soils tend to be poor in nutrients because the dry conditions allow the topsoil, the most fertile layer of soil, to be blown away by the wind. The process is called wind erosion, and it makes farming even more difficult by removing valuable nutrients from the soil. Question 5. What does the professor suggest farmers should do in years with very little rainfall? Answer B. Abandon farming for that year to save resources. The professor explains that farming in dry lands is unpredictable. Some years may be better than others, but in extremely dry years, farmers have to make a difficult decision. Instead of planting and risking a failed crop, they should be prepared to abandon farming for that season. This way, they can save important resources like seeds, fertilizers, and energy for a better year. On the other hand, when the weather conditions are good, farmers should take advantage by planting more and working harder to increase their harvest. Great! We've finished the first lecture. Unlike this one, some lectures and the questions after them can be very tricky, but with the right note-taking skills, you can answer every question correctly. In fact, note-taking is one of the most important skills for succeeding in the TOEFL listening section. It's not always easy though. Some students don't take enough notes and miss key points that would help with the answers, while others try to write down everything and end up losing sight of the main idea. If you want to master note-taking once and for all, join our TOEFL course. We'll not only practice with mock tests, but also go over both lecture and conversation scripts to highlight what's important to write down. I'll teach you key strategies for the listening section that will make answering questions easier, and we'll cover important vocabulary like campus-related terms that will help you in the listening, speaking, and writing sections. If you're struggling to get the score you want in the listening section or overall, click the link below to sign up. Let's move on to the second lecture.
Listen to part of a lecture in a history class.
So we've been talking about early civilizations, those that existed 7,000 to 8,000 years ago. And today I'd like to talk about the switch from foraging, or searching for whatever wild foods are available, to farming, intentionally cultivating crops. Now, the way that switch is frequently portrayed is that it was an improvement. The development of agriculture is usually portrayed as a good thing. But there are advantages to foraging. For one thing, it provides a better balance of nutrients and, in particular, more protein, at least compared to the diet of the early farmers. Foragers end up eating a greater mix of foods, both plants and animals. But the early farmers, and to some extent this is still true today, the early farmers concentrated on just a few crops, like rice and wheat. There was less variety and therefore a smaller range of nutrients, and a lot more carbohydrates. So the quality of the diet wasn't as good. And we have evidence of this. In Greece and Turkey, when comparing skeletons from forager communities to those of early farming communities, we see that height declined when farming was adopted. Quite dramatically, I might add. Foragers were, on average, almost 15 centimeters taller than the early farmers. That's a lot. Furthermore, farming increased one's vulnerability to starvation. It was riskier to live off cultivated crops than to live off the wild, partly because it meant living off fewer plants. I mean, farmers, even modern farmers, only cultivate about 20 different plants on average. And even then, they really focus on just 3, wheat, rice, and maize. Modern foragers, on the other hand, depend on over 100 different plants, what with fruits, nuts, berries, roots, beans, and so on. So, if a few cultivated crops failed, if the rice crops failed, for example, the farmers were in trouble. Now, of course, wild plants could fail too, but foragers eat so many different plants, they'd always have something to eat. Also, domesticated plants may be more prone to failure than wild plants. Don't forget, agricultural crops are the result of selective breeding. Farmers choose certain seeds, ones that have the qualities they want, refining the crop each harvest. So, if seeds from the plumpest potatoes or the whitest rice grains are chosen, the hardier strains, the ones that can resist insect attacks or disease or extremes of temperature or moisture, for example, may be eliminated because the farmer hasn't chosen seeds from plants with these characteristics. So how did the switch from foraging to agriculture happen? Well, no one's really sure. Some speculate that during the final phase of the last ice age, about 10 to 13,000 years ago, there was a shift in climate in a number of locations that led to the decrease of food you could forage for. The failure of wild harvests may have caused people in different parts of the world to plant some crops to make up for the shortage. There's evidence that the practice of cultivation existed at that time. For example, rice was cultivated in China as long as 10,000 years ago by people who were also still eating wild rice. By counting the proportions of wild rice and cultivated rice in plant fossil remains, archaeologists have determined that the switch to farming there was a slow one, taking about 4,000 years. So it didn't happen overnight. And there's evidence that other groups of people also cultivated some cereal crops, blending both foraging and farming for thousands of years. So putting people in little boxes, classifying them as either foragers or farmers, well, we don't do that anymore. Of course, there were advantages to farming. Agriculture provided a greater quantity of food. And when you have an increasing population, as was the case in ancient southwestern Asia, that's a definite advantage. Also, with irrigation, crops could be planted in what was until then useless land. For example, wheat and barley didn't grow naturally on the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in ancient Mesopotamia. But once that land was irrigated, all of it could become cultivated. And hectare for hectare, farming yielded more food than foraging. Farmers needed 20 times less land, 100 times less if they irrigated, to feed the same number of people as foragers needed.
Question 1. What is the lecture mainly about? The correct answer is A. The relative advantages of foraging and farming. The professor talks about the switch from foraging, finding wild food, to farming, growing crops. She begins by saying that although the development of agriculture is usually considered a good thing, there are many advantages to foraging. She then discusses the benefits. After that, she says that no one knows for sure why the switch from foraging to farming happened, and talks a bit about how some cultures combined foraging and farming. Finally, she talks about the benefits of farming. So the lecture is mostly about the benefits of both foraging and farming. Question 2. In what ways was the forager diet preferable to that of the early farmer? It had greater variety. Answer A is correct. The professor explains that foragers ate a wide variety of foods, both plants and animals, which gave them a better balance of nutrients. Early farmers ate mainly a few crops, which did not give them as much variety or as many nutrients. Question 3. Why does the professor mention skeletons found in Greece and Turkey? Answer C. To contrast the difference in height between early farmers and foragers. The professor talks about skeletons from Greece and Turkey to show that foragers were taller than early farmers, about 15 centimeters. Question 4. According to the professor, what was a possible result of the selective breeding of crop plants? The correct answer is B. The plants became more vulnerable to disease. Selective breeding involves picking seeds with the best traits to improve the harvest. However, farmers tend to focus on qualities like size and appearance rather than factors like resistance to insects or diseases. As a result, the crops become more vulnerable to problems compared to wild plants. Question 5. What is the professor's attitude toward the classification of ancient people as either foragers or farmers? Answer D is correct. She believes that the evidence now indicates that the situation was more complex. The professor says it's too simple to classify people as just foragers or farmers. Many people did both for a long time. The change from foraging to farming was slow and complicated, so we can't put people into just one category. Finally, question 6. Why does the professor mention irrigation? Answer C. To support her point about farming providing a great quantity of food. The professor talks about irrigation, watering land, to show that farming can produce more food. She explains how irrigation helped ancient Mesopotamia grow crops where they couldn't before, making farming much more productive than foraging. That's the end of our lesson. Thanks for watching. Please let me know in the comments how many points you got right in each lecture and which words were new for you. As always, I wish you all a stellar TOEFL score. Until next time, bye!